Good morning.
Good morning.
It's wonderful to be with you once again. The title of my sermon is All Praise to the Great Web on Being a Seventh Principle Unitarian Universalist. I want to start with a question. How do you know you belong here? Here, in this room, with a gathered congregation of Unitarian Universalists who are associated with the wider movement embodied in the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations. There are not right or wrong answers to this question, of course. Part of the fun, and sometimes the great challenge of being you, is that for most any question we come up with lots of different answers. One of the ways I realized I belonged years ago when I started showing up on Sunday mornings at the UU church down the street from my house was in reading the 7 principles, which that congregation printed in its order of service. So, I know you don't have a printed order of service, but I asked somebody before the service, do you have the principles posted on a wall somewhere? Because lots of congregations do, and you didn't seem to, but Lucy went back somewhere and magically produced this framed poster, which is the principles of the Unitarian Universalist Association of Congregations, and also the 6 sources, which I think I did a sermon about the 6 sources back in the spring when I was here. So this is up here if you want to look at it later. You can also see the principles and purposes in your hymnal. If you turn to hymn number 1 and then go back 1 page more toward the beginning, you'll be looking at those. But those of you who have been Unitarian Universalism for a while know what I'm talking about. The rest of you, just come along with us and it will begin to make sense as we go. For immediate purposes, I want you to know that the 7th principle is respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Okay? So, when I first read the whole list of the 7 principles, I recognized in that list many of my own most cherished values, and I wanted to get to know the spiritual tradition and the organization that allowed the emergence of this rather nicely crafted statement. Someday, perhaps, we might want to think together about the 7 principles in their entirety, their history, their usefulness to Unitarian Universalist life. But for now, I have another question. Do you have a favorite principle out of those 7? Which one is it and why? Again, no right answer, but I'm, as you might guess from the title of my talk, going to tell you about my answer to that question. And if you stay for second hour and you are familiar with the 7 principles, I'd love to hear your answer, especially if it's different from mine. While I appreciate principles 1 through 6 and find them to be nice summaries of what I've learned all my life about how the world ought to be and how individuals should aspire to act in relationship, the 7th principle really grabbed me from the first. And it continues to serve, nurture, and challenge me as my spiritual journey evolves. We Unitarian Universalists covenant in the words of our 7th principle to affirm and promote respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. Although I almost always swap out interdependent for interconnected, that's my own little thing, you can ask me about it if you want later, I just love this statement. And I feel like I could spend the rest of my life listening to it and contemplating it and learning to live fully into it. So much packed into just a few evocative words. Respect for the interdependent web of all existence of which we are a part. First, there's this concept of the web, the metaphor really, of the web at the center of this 7th principle. Now, I like poetry, and some of it I love, but I'm really not very poetically sophisticated. I took creative writing in college, but I took it pass-fail, and I didn't write any really good poetry. And I can't claim still to be a discerning reader of poetry. But in that class, I did encounter and develop a fondness for the poetry of Denise. And I think the really cool first name probably helped. But finding Levertov years later in our hymnal was a treat for my newly UU soul. Number 525, a poem entitled Web, is now one of my favorites. And here it is. intricate and untraceable, weaving and interweaving, dark strand with light. Designed beyond all spiderly contrivance to link, not to entrap. Elation, grief, joy, contrition entwined, shaking, changing, forever forming, transforming. All praise to the great web. I like this poem because it points beyond an easy celebration of nature or the earth, without dismissing it or reducing earth-centeredness to mere environmentalism. In much the same vein, I recently encountered a midweek email from another church that had this excerpt from an essay by the Reverend Forrest Gilmore. Our seventh principle, respect for the interdependent web of all existence, is a glorious statement. Yet we make a profound mistake when we limit it to merely an environmental idea. It is so much more. It is our response to the great dangers of both individualism and oppression. It is our solution to the seeming conflict between the individual and the group. Our seventh principle may be our Unitarian Universalist way of coming to fully embrace something greater than ourselves. The interdependent web, expressed as the spirit of life, the ground of all being, the oneness of all existence, the community-forming power, the process of life, the creative force, even God, can help us develop that social understanding of ourselves that we and our culture so desperately need. It is a source of meaning to which we can dedicate our lives. So that again was the Reverend Forrest Gilmore. Glorious is exactly how this seventh principle often feels to me. What I like about Gilmore's commentary is that it suggests that this principle points us beyond environmentalism to the process of life in which the earth and its inhabitants are embedded. It urges us to look beyond ourselves, whether by that we mean individuals or groups, to something larger, and shifts our orientation from anything we can comfortably wrap our minds around to a deeper reality that we try to name with phrases like the ground of being and the oneness of all. Gilmore notes a seeming conflict between the individual and the group and calls for development of a social understanding of ourselves. This is exactly where I see some interesting possibilities in our seventh principle and want to push it a little bit farther. Long ago, before I was a UU, an ethics professor told me that I had to choose between an understanding of human personhood as individualistic and an understanding of humanness as collective. I didn't argue with her, but I didn't believe her. To be honest, whenever possible, I balk at either-or choices and tend to favor both and understanding. It is undeniably one of my own personal biases. My deepest intuition was and is that however you understand what it is to be human, being an individual and being connected to oh so very much beyond one's own self are both true and both inescapable. Today, I know how I would articulate a refusal of a forced choice between the dangerous, lonely individualism and the oppressive collectivism Gilmore identifies, and it is a gloriously webby rebuttal, heavily influenced by universalism. All praise to the great web. The UU principle of respect for the web, especially taken in the context of our 7 principles and 6 sources, suggests that we human beings, and really many other beings, including animals, plants, and to some extent mountains and rocks, are unique individuals and embedded in social, biological, historical, experiential, and spiritual matrices. And all this richness of what it means to exist is hard to grasp when pulled apart and analyzed one bit at a time. It happens all at once. Alan Watts, who was a 20th century British-American interpreter of Eastern philosophy, in particular Zen Buddhism. Some of you may have encountered him before. Watts suggests a shift in perspective on ourselves that I find quite helpful here. He wrote, or actually it may have been in an interview, I'm not sure, "You didn't come into this world, you came out of it like a wave from the ocean. You are not a stranger here." All praise to the great web. We are individually unique because of the different ways we're connected to the web. But to be an individual is to be embedded in relationship. It's simply not possible for an individual to exist, to be, apart from everything else that is. As much as we sometimes wish it were so, as much as our culture has trained us to expect or desire independence as the goal of mature human life and personal development. Thinking I can be an individual in and of myself all alone is like expecting to be able to live and breathe air without oxygen, like thinking a wave can be apart from its webby ocean source. We often act and speak as if we think personal dignity depends on independence. When we do that, we set ourselves up for a good bit of distress and fear, which is rather well-grounded, as evidenced by the all-too common abuse of children, elders, folks who are vulnerable in any of the ways of human fragility, as we all have been, are, or will be at some point in our lives, or points in our lives. We very easily get stuck in habits of thinking and relating that make it very difficult to practice the first of our 7 principles, which affirms the inherent worth and dignity of every person. So over the years, I've been on the lookout for other ways of thinking about who we are as human beings. I like our Unitarian Universalist commitment to the web of all existence because it gives me space within the context of a spiritual community to play with these ideas. I like our Universalist heritage, which tells me that hell is for no one, and we're all in this together. I remember another grad school professor, this one a historian, who once said, "The world is probably not as Origen described it, but it should be." Origen was a very, very early Christian theologian. Wikipedia says he was the first, but I think that's debatable. Origen believed that all of creation emanated from God and ultimately will return to unity with the divine. I know now that he often shows up in UU histories as a forerunner of the Universalist strand of our movement, and ideas about universal salvation run throughout the history of the Christian tradition, sometimes considered illicit, but never completely eradicated. This conviction of universalism, the idea that the God who creates and loves all will preserve all in oneness, runs particularly strong in the mystical traditions of many religious traditions. One of my favorite books from the Christian contemplative tradition, written by Franciscan priest Richard Rohr, is entitled Everything Belongs. And frankly, the title's my very favorite thing about that whole book, although the rest of it I like too. But everything belongs. It is exactly this sense that everything, from all sorts of angles, belongs in the story of our lives, our species, our planet, our universe. This sense is what drew me to the 7th Unitarian Universalist principle. I find its statement of our human experience and commitments as bound up with the rest of existence, both beautiful and challenging. All praise to the great web. Parenting small children gave me opportunities to reflect on what I most wanted for them as they grew. Did I want them to be able to be independent, able to care for themselves without asking for help? Or did I want them to know what they wanted and how to communicate those wants within the context of relationships? And of course, that's an either-or question, and to some extent I say both. But in the process of reflecting on life with these very short people, I came to resist the language of dependence and independence. I don't even really like the word interdependence. I might have mentioned it to some of you in a talk back once, but I once wrote a paper that had 8 pages of etymological analysis, which I'm going to spare you. And in that paper, I came to the conclusion that the Latin root pendere is threatening to our limbic brains, but you can ask me if you really want to know how I got there. Instead of extolling the virtue of interdependence while trying to figure out how independence can be both dangerous and a necessary developmental task, I like to promote autonomy or self-rule in myself, my children, for nations, in congregations, and even in church committees. While understanding that autonomy is experienced and practiced always and only in the context of connection to other individuals and to all that exists. All praise to the great web. As Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh explains this connection, everything that is participates in what he calls interbeing. His classic example of interbeing is seeing a cloud in, all our pieces of paper are covered in plastic, so there's even more webs, but seeing a cloud in this piece of paper. Without the cloud, there would be no rain, no plants, no trees, no paper. So in the paper is not only the cloud, but also the sun, the farmer, the truck or cart that hauled the crop to the paper mill, the driver who brought the finished product to market, and even the people without whom there would be no customers, without whom there would be no demand for the paper. Here, as in Buddhist thought generally, nothing exists only in and for itself. Nothing exists independently. Everything is connected by virtue of its existence, connected in one of our favorite metaphors as if by multiple strands of a web. And sometimes this is wonderful, as when we sing graces that teach our children to appreciate all that goes into our food and its preparation. All praise to the great web. But sometimes this radical sense of interconnection challenges more than it comforts or delights. Thich Nhat Hanh teaches that we human beings, as part of the oneness that underlies reality, are all fundamentally connected. He goes so far as to say, I am because you are. And this applies to any combination of beings, sometimes in ways that make me blanch and want to squirm and somehow wriggle out of my unavoidable complicity in the heartache and violence and lack of compassion in the world. For example, it's usually nice to consider that because I am, my children are. I can pat myself on the back once in a while, knowing that because of my more or less adequate parenting skills, they survived infancy and now move about the world increasingly able to make their own choices. It's slightly less fun to realize that because I tend to worry more than necessary, they carry in their biochemistries and their habits somewhat more anxiety than is strictly optimal. I find it distressing to realize that because our families of origin enjoyed certain benefits decades ago in the real estate market by virtue of skin color, my partner and I and our children experience life in America on strikingly different terms than other families do. To better understand the implications of interbeing, we might even say that because my teenage son can walk down the street relatively confident of his safety, another mother's son is in danger every day. Because I was thirsty or needed clothing, marine life dies in encountering trash or toxins. Because we believe in democracy and free speech, leaders emerge who do not serve the common good. This connection stuff is really hard. All praise to the great web. Believing in and honoring our commitment to an interconnected web of all existence seems to require that we come to terms with more than just the beautiful sunsets, the awe-inspiring vistas, and the variety of engaging creatures with whom we share our planet. More than just the warmth of nurturing relationships, and more than just the myriad ways in which we can choose to express ourselves and live out our highest values. As much as these are truly part of all that is our lives, respecting the web means, I think, that we must also cultivate the willingness to see and understand ourselves and the web, to know that we are not our own, and our being and our doing have effects beyond those we feel directly. To acknowledge that death is necessary to feed life, to accept the fragility, vulnerability, and susceptibility to abuse inherent in relationship, to admit that undeserved privilege is usually based on privation and oppression, and to find the courage to take responsibility both individually and in groups for our failures to be our best selves. This is our glorious seventh principle, and it is hard, and it can be scary, and it's a good thing we're all in it together, because I'm going to need some encouragement sometimes. I suspect you will too. But take heart, my friends. We are not alone. We are not left without resources for these tasks. We are not just held in the web, but constituted by it. And as Levertov reminds us, the purpose of all this connection, this great web, is to link, not to entrap. Jesus says in the New Testament of the Christian Bible, "Be not afraid." The visions of Julian of Norwich, all shall be well. The Tao Te Ching, the Tao endures, your body dies. There is no danger. If the web includes all existence, if everything belongs, then I belong too, as do you. All praise to the great web. The great web is the beholding and the being beheld in stories of humans and marine mammals watching and playing with each other. It is also the hairball your cat left for you to step in. And it is the furry companion who seems to notice your despondence and climbs into your lap or drapes themselves around or beside you to purr or rumble soothingly. It is the first crop of nectarines growing on the tree in my front yard, and the cheeky squirrel who stopped outside the kitchen window to eat one of them in front of me every single morning this spring, and the gnarly growths on a few of the nectarine leaves and the weird sticky goo on some of the fruit. We don't know what these are, but my beloved who planted the tree reminded me with a shrug that when you go organic, bad things happen. All praise to the great web. And according to our seventh principle, it all belongs. It is all respectable. It all has inherent worth. And if I am willing to try living inside the understanding that everything exists, is inextricably connected within this all, then I belong too. And this is how I know I belong here this morning with you, my Unitarian Universalist siblings. Because Unitarian Universalism at its best can provide the space and the vision and the courage and the good company necessary to sustain a life lived trying to really see the truth of who we are and trying to live fully and gloriously into the promises we make to each other and to the great web that is larger than us, that has held many before us, holds many besides us, and will continue to hold much long after we are gone.